Well, hello there. We're back for snow again. This is Joe Hoyle, and I'm going to go through the class for yesterday. About a third, maybe a little bit more than that, of the students missed that class because of the snow. So I'm going to cover exactly what we covered in class. So there should be no disadvantage from having not been there. He probably doesn't have the excitement of being called on. But this should get the material to you. At this moment, I do not know what the situation is going to be for tomorrow. I suspect we'll have class, and I suspect it'll go fine. But until the school makes some announcement, I don't know that for a fact. So let's go to work. Let's get to it. Going to share the screen, of course, and as you can see, we started off in class by talking about test number one. And so I wanted the students all to know how the grade distribution went. And as you can see from this, we had a very large percentage of people, approximately 70% of, of the three classes that made an A or a B. Now, that was great. I mean, I'm always thrilled if I get close to 60%. So to get to 70% was excellent. I am, as I always am, concerned by the folks who didn't make an A or a B. But going back to what I said in the earlier class, keep in mind this first test is only 20%. If you if you really put some work into it, and if you're down in this group, as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason you cannot make an A in this class. Now you'll have to get to it. You'll have to really think about how to get better, but you can do that. I would also like to see some of these folks. We had an awful lot of people who made a B, and 87 or 88. I'd like to see some of you push your way up into that A category. So there's still work to be done, but you can see how the class did. I always like for the students to know the very top paper. So we had, of the 66 people who took the exam, we had two students who made 96, and we had three students who made 95. And so they can know that they were in the top 10% of the students. That was great. There was a curve on this test. There's a curve on all of my tests if you've not been in my class before. So the first 10 points, I counted off a curve of zero point 0.6. The rest of the points, the curve was 0.44. So let's assume, for example, this is the example I used in class. Let's assume, I'm trying to remember exactly how to get this all to work off here in this case. Let's assume that there was a minus 50, that you missed 50 points. So what I did was I took the first 10 points, multiplied that by zero point 0.6, and that was just 6. That left 40 more points. The other 40 points, that curve was 0.44, 44. That's, if my math is correct, that's 17.6. So if you missed 50 points, the first 10 points counted 6 points, the next 40 points counted 17.6. That equals 23.6. I would have rounded that off to 24, and your grade would have been a 76. So you can check it. Now, what you'll see is that when you get your test back, the curve will have been applied on the test. I always do it on the test so you can see how I got the grade in that case. So that was the grade. Now, I did talk to the students a little bit about the grades and how they could get better. And I think you should do the same thing. You should, stop and think about how you can do better on the second test. It may only be 20%, but it does indicate something. And if you don't like what it indicates, then you need to start taking actions to get better with this in this case. So, a couple of things I suggested. One was don't leave this test until you spend some time looking over the test. If you didn't do well and then you just walk away and don't think about it, then you've learned nothing from the test. That's a bad idea. Now, one possibility is that you did well, you had a good grade. Well, then think about how you can continue making that same grade. What can you can do to continue making that same grade? So if you made a 96, and you want to make a 96 on the next test, look at that test and see what you did well and try to emulate it going forward. On the other hand, if you did poorly, if you wanted to make a 96 and you didn't make a 96, then what changes are needed? If you're unhappy, the first thing you have to do is to look at the test because there were people who made 96s and 95s. What did they do that you didn't do? Learn from that test. Figure out how you can get better. Because we'll have a second test. They'll come up pretty soon in this case. We have three tests this semester, so they come up about every 3 weeks. So pretty soon you'll be ready to do another test, and I want you to do better if you want to do better next time. Two other things I think you should think about. One is specifically, what grade would you like to make on the second test? So if, for example, you'd like to make a 93, then think about that 93. Everything you do, think about what did I do what needed to be done to get to that goal? I think too many students have vague goals. They say, I want to get better. I will make a good grade. Well, that doesn't do very much. Pick a number you like. If you want to make a 99, pick 99. If you're happy with an 86, pick 86. And one of the suggestions I made was write that on a big piece of paper and put that somewhere in your apartment or in your dorm room that you can look at to remind yourself that that's what you're shooting for and that you need to figure out how to get there. I did one other thing in class because this was just something I felt needed to be done. I think a lot of students mess up after class. And I would suggest, and I've suggested this before, but I would suggest that you really spend some time on your notes after class. If we have class, let's say at 1:30, and you get out at 2:20, and you don't think about that for 24 hours, well, then it has begun to kind of disseminate. You begin to lose that information. So I'm a strong believer that if you can get within, let's say 3 to 4 hours, if you can sit down and you can in some way list out everything we covered so that you have a documented list or a documented outline of the class, I think that's helpful. Now, I know students come to me all the time and say, I don't have 3 or 4 hours. I don't, just don't have that much time. And my comment always is that I tell everybody, when you take 302, always take it on a semester when you can get some free time because it's tricky. This is a hard class. And if you've got a lot other things to do, then you might want to put this class off until the fall. Now, I'm not trying to tell people to drop the class, but the class is taught every semester. And if this is a busy semester for you, and it's going to cause you to have trouble doing well, you can drop this class. I don't know what the last date to drop it is, but it's not come yet. And then take it in the fall, and I think you'll do better. You need an easier semester when you're taking 302. The other thing, of course, I talk about this all the time, is the practice problems. When I send a practice problem out, I firmly believe that you should work that immediately. Don't take long, but work it immediately. If you get it right, then you know you picked up from class what I wanted you to pick up. If you get it wrong, or if you cannot get it, then bring it by and I'll sit and help you. I go back to what I said before the test. I've got 71 students. Probably, I'm guessing 30% have been in my office. 30% have come by to ask questions. That means that 70% have never shown up in my office, have not gotten one piece of advice, have not gotten one piece of help in the case. Now, if you're going to make 96, then you don't need my help. But if you're going to make a bad grade, if I were you, I'd come by and get some advice or get some help. And the practice problems serve that purpose. Now, let's work a problem. So what I wanted to start the class off is to tell the students, okay, what we're doing, what we did in class on Monday is a method that's called the effective rate method. So here's how this works. Let's assume you issue a $1 million bond that's due in 10 years. And this is just the contract. I mean, you've done this. You've seen this. We've had a contract with this. So you have this contract. It pays 8% annual interest every 12/31. So you don't have to worry about breaking it into every 6 months. You're forced to negotiate a 10% rate. In other words, no one would buy the 8% rate. They wanted a 10% rate. Happens all the time in the real world. What do? It's those two steps that we always talk about. The first one is figure out the future cash flows. That is set by the contract. That is set. That won't change. You have to figure that out. When we do leases, we do this all the time, where I will say, you have to tell me the cash flows. Once you know the cash flows, then of course you compute the present value. And I think we've done enough work. The computing the present value is something you can do. But I don't want to do that here. That's not the purpose of my asking this question. I want to make an assumption that they sell this bond for $870,000. I left one of the zeros off there. So we know that. They've already done that, $870,000. And it's January 1, year one, and they sold the bond for 870,000. So we come up here and we make the entries. And this is just exactly what you and I have already done in class. We debit cash for 870, we credit bond payable for 870, and what I'm demonstrating is what we call the effective rate method, which is the proper way to record this problem. I always make two entries. There is a cash entry where cash is either paid or the accrued cash interest is recorded. And then once you have the cash entry, then you make a compounding entry. Two entries, a cash entry and a compounding entry. The cash entry is just what they pay. In this bond, it was $1 million bond. They paid 8% interest. 8% of $1 million is 80,000. Debit interest expense, 80,000. Credit cash, 80,000. Now, we've done this several times, so I don't really plan to do it this time. But there is two problems when you record it that way. The first one is that you got to get from that 8% interest all the way up to 10%. I used to usually call that our first problem. And then you've got a bond that's on the books at 870, but they're not going to pay 870. They're going to pay $1 million. So you've got to get from 870 to $1 million. Those two problems are the essence of this compounding entry. And you find this by simply doing a process. How much is the bond payable on the books? Well, the bond payable right now is $870,000. What was the yield rate? The yield rate was 10%. That means that the interest is $87,000 per year. You paid $80,000. How do you report the other $7,000? You take the $87,000 that was computed. $80,000 of that was made up by the cash payment. So you have a compound amount, and that compound amount is $7,000. The compound amount is this. You have calculated the amount of interest, which in this case is $87,000. You have recorded the amount that was paid, which in this case is $80,000. The remainder, the other $7,000, is added to the principal. That adding it to the principal is referred to as compounding. So in this question, what you're doing is you're taking the 87,000 they computed, you're subtracting the 80,000 they paid, and then you're recognizing interest expense of 7, and that gives you the correct 87,000, and you're increasing your bond payable because you've got to move that bond payable toward $1 million. And that process we've done, we will do often in the case. Well, I want to show you a different way to do this. It's the same basic idea, but it's done in a much simpler fashion. And that is, you make your cash entry, it's 80,000. You then say, okay, I have to have a second entry. And in that second entry, I'm not going to think any about the interest expense. My only goal is to get from the 870 to the 1 million. That's the only goal in the straight line method. You don't worry about the 8 to 10. You just simplify the whole process by saying, I've got an $870,000 bond. In 10 years, it needs to be $1 million. I'm going to get it there. So you take the $1 million, that's the face value, also called the maturity value. You take the 870, which is what it was sold for. The $130,000 is the discount. The bond was for 10 years. So what we're going to do is for each of those 10 years, we're going to increase interest expense for $13,000. and we're going to increase the bond payable for 13,000. And if you do that, then that bond payable will gradually, over those 10 years, move from 870 to $1 million. Why is that wrong? It looks awfully good. Why is that a wrong process? Well, the reason that's wrong is that 80, which is the interest expense plus 13, is 93,000. The bond is on the books at 870, and that is not 10%. So even though we sold the bond to equal 10%, that is not 10%. I don't know what it is, but it's certainly not 10% in that case. The reason I bring this up, and I have kind of two processes here, two thoughts here in this case. I bring this up because this is the way most companies actually do this process. Most companies just use the straight line method because it's not terribly different from the effective rate method. So if I were you and I was sitting at home, and I go, well, why do we learn the effective rate method if most companies use the straight line method? That's an easy answer. We're going to move from bonds payable to leases. And in leases, you have to use the effective rate method. It simply won't work otherwise. So what I'm doing here is trying to set you up so that when we move into the lease chapter, this will be easy. Because in the lease chapter, you're going to have to use the effective rate method. So in class yesterday, I then moved over and said, okay, time to do some problems. So let's look at day 15, number one. And so if I were you, if you haven't done this one, then turn this video off and go do it. I mean, that's the only way to learn the material. Watching me do it just proves I can do it. Now, if you've already worked it, then keep watching. But if you haven't done this one, stop the video, go do it, and then come back and see how well you did in this case. And I think that would be just helpful for anybody to do in that case. So let's assume that you've either worked it once or you've worked it twice or whatever. And we always start off with the facts according to the contract. And these are easy. And you'll notice this problem is very much like the practice problem we did in class on Monday. And I simply want to make sure you can do it. So I believe between the class problem on Monday and this problem here today, then you'll be set. I don't think you need to do 9 or 10 versions. I personally think 2 should be enough. You always start off with the contract and what the facts are in the contract. Because the contract only has certain things. $40,000 face value, 8 years. So in 8 years, they're going to pay $40,000. The bond pays 6% annual cash interest, and you can see that 6% of $40,000 will be $2,400. But payments are made every 6 months on March the 1st and September the 1st. So you start off here with quite a bit of factual information. There's a little bit more that you need to think about. One is that anytime you get ready to do present value, you need to know what a compound period is. And typically in a compound period, we simply take the period between the interest payments. So if they have interest payments on 3/1 and then another interest payment on 9/1, then the interest payments are every 6 months. And since the interest payments are every 6 months, then that typically is our compound period. So and that's important when we get ready to do present value. Notice that the cash interest rate is 6%. However, we're paying these things, this interest payment, every 6 months. So whenever we talk about this, even though it's a 6% annual rate, we talk about it being a 3% rate per time period. And every time period is 6 months. Now, one factor comes from outside of the contract. We go into the market, we try to sell our bond, and we eventually wind up with some type of a yield rate or an effective rate or a negotiated rate between you and the creditor. So I'm going to assume in this problem, I think this is in the problem, that that rate is 10% per year or 5% per time period since the time periods are every 6 months. So, and we covered this a lot in class. I just think it's important. Everything above that line is known. It's a fact. It's in the contract. The one thing that is not known is that negotiated rate, because you're going to use that negotiated rate then to determine how much they paid for this bond. Now, you can either get what they paid and determine the negotiated rate, or much more likely, you can know what the yield rate is, and then use that, as I've done here, to determine what they're actually going to pay in that case. So we go back to our two steps. I have mentioned before, first thing is you have to know the future cash flows. You cannot simply assume anything. You've got to know those cash flows. And then once you have those cash flows, you can do the present value. So what are the cash flows here? Well, typically there are two. There's interest, and then there's a payment on the principal. So the interest is $40,000 total. The cash, the stated rate is 6%, which is $2,400 per year. And I like to do that as a monthly figure. So that's $200 per month. They're paying interest twice per year. So therefore, there are 16 time periods. 2 time periods per year for 8 years is 16 time periods. So in that situation, $2,400 per year, we will pay $1,200 every 6 months for those 16 time periods. Legally, according to the contract, that's what you have agreed to pay. And so therefore, that's what we have to base the present value computation off of in this case. So you can see it's just exactly what I did. I have two cash flows, the $40,000 at the end, the $1,200 every 6 months. And I did this then using a conversion rate based on 5%. Now the problem says that they agreed upon 10%, but that was 10% per year. Here, your time periods are 6 months. So that interest rate there has to correspond with the same period of time as is in the actual problem, and that is every 6 months. So it's 5%, 16 time periods, and the $40,000 is a single amount. At the end of that time, we'll just have to pay $40,000. But the bond also has to pay $1,200 every 6 months. So therefore, again, it's 5%, 16 time periods, but this is an ordinary annuity. So if you take 40,000 times 0.45811 and you take 1,200 times 10.83777, comes back to a present value of 31,329. That's how much the creditor paid for the bond. So anytime you see this present value calculation, many times they're determining how much they should pay, and it's how much they should pay in order to make 5% for all 16 time periods. That literally is what they're trying to determine in this case. So we know how much they're going to pay. So let's see what we can do with that. So on March the 1st, they issue the bond for those amounts, or that amount, 31,329. How do we get that number? We found the future cash flows, and then we found the present value based upon the yield rate. Oh, that is just so important there. Find the future cash flows, find the present value based upon the yield rate for that period of time. Works perfectly. Now, we then go to September 1, where they're going to make the first cash interest payment of $1,200. Now remember, we're going to have a cash entry and a compounding entry. Nothing has changed. It's exactly the same as what we've done before. How much is the cash? How much is the interest they're going to compound? The cash interest is $1,200, and we've already determined that it's 2,400 for a full year times half a year, and that gives you cash interest of 1,200. So in our cash entry, we credit cash for 1,200 and we debit interest expense for 1,200. The problem is always going to be the compound entry. How much do we add to that to get to the proper rate? So on this video, this computation right there might be the most important thing we cover. And it's the compound interest. We take the 31,329. That is the bond payable at this point. We multiply it times the yield rate, which is 10% for a year or 5% for a half a year, and get 1566. That is interest expense. You're going to pay 1,200, yes, but the 1566 is the amount interest expense. So in the compound entry, you've already made the $1,200 entry and payment. So you've got to make the amount that brings these two numbers up to the 1566. So you took the 1,200 that you paid and you added the 366 compounding and you recognized 1566. Oh, if you can do that, the next chapter is going to be so much simpler in this case. And I did one more thing. When I compounded the 366, I wanted, and I'm going to erase this board so I have a little cleaner in this case. I have compounded the 366. So the bond payable, which was 31,329, you have added this 366 and it's now 31,695. Very important to always know what the bond payable is. So when I work these problems here at my house, anytime I make a change in the bond payable, I come over here and keep a running total of that bond payable balance because I don't want, let's say it's a test, I don't want to get lost trying to find out what that balance is. I might as well keep it. That way I will know what I'm looking for. So you've got those two entries that get you from 3.1 to 9.1. Now, on 12/31, you have to record interest for the 4 months from 9/1 to 12/31. Because on 12/31, you're going to make financial statements. So the financial statements have to be updated to the correct amount. How much is the cash interest? For 6 months, it's $1,200. So for 4 of those 6 months, it's 4, 6 to 1,200, it's $800. We're splitting this up so that you can record the first 4 months. The effective interest rate, though, is next. So we take the balance of the bond payable, 31,695, which is exactly what I had written on the previous page, multiply it times the yield rate of 5%, and you get 1585. That computation is paramount importance. How much is the payable? How much is the real appropriate interest rate? How much is the interest? 1585. But we've got a problem here. There's only 4 months between 9/1 and 12/31. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these numbers and we're not going to use the 1585. We're going to split it up for 4 months to handle September, October, November, and December, and then handle 2 more months for January and February of the next year. That splitting process is important because you have this bond that starts in 1 year and goes into the second year. So how much was the cash interest? $800. So you make the interest expense. Even though it's a cash entry, you don't credit cash. You're not paying it today. The payment is delayed until, I guess it was March 1st. So therefore, instead of crediting cash, you credit interest payable. So I always call this the cash entry. Even though you're not paying cash, it's a cash amount. We have determined up here that the real interest is 1,057. Well, if the real interest is 1,057, and if you've paid 800, then you've got to compound the other 257. We did that process on Monday. I'm doing it again today just to be sure you're comfortable with it. And I've got one more thing to do, and that is I've got to now make an entry for March 1. And on March 1, that's a payment date. So they pay $1,200. 800 of that is for the interest payable. So you pay the $1,200 and you take off the $800 that was the payable, and the difference is the $400, and that's $200 a month, January and February. Anytime, though, that you record interest expense, you also have to record the compound entry. How much is the compound entry? Well, back here, we did the interest expense for 6 months. 5% of 31,695 is 1,585. But we don't want 1,585. That's for 6 months. So since the first payment covers 4 months, we multiply that by 4 over 6, get 1,057. And then the other 2 months, January and February, we multiply the 1,585 again, but this time times 26 to get 528. So the extra 257 goes there. That covers 4 months. The extra 128 goes there, and that covers January and February, and that brings our payable balance up to $32,080. Now we're almost finished. We've almost got it done. So we've got the balance up to 32,000. Then what we're going to finish off and do this problem is that on July 1, after 4 more months, which is $200 per month in interest, they pay off the bond. They pay it off early. You can often do that. Notice here I have tried to do exactly what I've done before, and that is I made a cash entry. I have made a compounding entry, and then I add on the payoff. Well, how many months was it? March, April, May, June. It was 4 months, $200 a month. Your cash payment would be for $800. But you have to bring that up based upon the compounding. So I took the 32,080, the number from the previous slide. The real interest rate that we sold it for was 10% for a year or 5% for 6 months. So it would have been 1604 if we were talking about 6 months. However, we're not talking about 6 months, we're talking about 4 months. So you multiply the 4 over 6 times 1,069, and what you get is an additional amortization, or an additional compounding, I guess is better to say, of 269. You have the cash entry, and then you have the compounding entry. It's just repetitious. That brings your bond payable balance to $32,349. What happens then? They pay the bond off. The bond is called early. So the bond is a $40,000 bond. It is called back at 102%, 1.02 of the face value. So for that reason, you have to pay $40,800. That's the amount you pay to get rid of this bond. At the same time, the bond payable balance is just removed entirely. Get rid of the cash, get rid of the bond payable, because the cash has been used to pay off the bond. That leaves a difference between these two amounts. You paid $40,800 for a bond that was on your books at $32,349. You paid an additional $8,451. So since you paid more, that $8,451 becomes your loss. And that's problem 15, number 1. Now, we didn't finish 15.2, but we did get it started. So I wanted to draw the point here in class that this is a serial bond. Every time they make a payment, they pay interest and they pay some of the principals. Interest, principal, interest, principal. In the problem we just worked, what they did was they paid the interest, I think it's $1,200 a time, but they didn't pay the principal until the very end. So this idea that you're paying both the principal and the interest every time is what makes it complicated, makes it more complicated than it might look in this case. So let's look at it. So the first thing, of course, you have to do is you have to find the cash flows. And this was tricky in class. They start off with a cash or the face value of 80,000. And it says that every year they pay off 20,000. So if you start with 80,000 and pay off 20, then your face value is only 60,000. If you start with 60,000 and make a payment, then your face value is only 40. And finally, if you start with 40,000 and make a payment, your face value is 20,000. So what we're trying to do here is to determine that the company actually pays 20,000 per year. In addition, though, they make cash interest payments and the rate is 6%. So 6% of 80,000 is 4,800. 6% of 60,000 is 3,600. 6% of 40,000 is 2,400 and 6% of 20,000 is 1,200. So if you simply follow the contract, then you know that you're going to make payments. Those four payments are going to be interest payments, and those four payments are going to be principal payments. Since you're trying to find the future cash flow, you just add them up. At the end of the first year, I pay 4,800 and 20,000. I pay 24,800. At the end of the second year, I paid 3,600 plus 20,000. I paid 3,600. And what you've got then is, you know, legally or contractually, that your company has to make these four payments. You've got the future cash flows. Once you have that, then what you can do is you can take those amounts and you can find the present value. So I simply took those four amounts and brought them over here and said, okay, those are our future cash flows. I then multiplied it each time by a conversion rate. They're all single amounts. Why are they not annuities? They're not annuities because they're different. An annuity has to be the same amount in equal time periods. These are not the same amount. So it has to be four single amounts. The negotiated rate was 8%. The one thing that might cause problems is the number of time periods. You can see there, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So here's the way it looks to me. This is right now. This is year one. The end of year one, we're going to pay $24,800. Here's year two. At the end of year two, we're going to pay $23,600. So when we're doing present value from now, then going to that first $24,800 payment is a number of one time period. But going to the 23,600 is two periods. You go 1, 2. So when we make the computation of the present value, we use the 2 as the number of time periods. Be sure and do this yourself, just to be sure you can do it. As I said once or twice already, all we're proving here is I can do it. And we already knew I could do it. What we need is for you to be able to do it. When you make those computations, the present values, those four numbers, they add up to 76,561. And when they add up to 76,561, this is what the investor pays. The investor pays 76,561. And in exchange, the investor gets a contract which requires those four payments. That really is how the bond market works. And this number here has been so calculated that we know that if you invest the 76,561 and you get those cash flows, that you're getting an 8% rate of return on your money. Now, I thought that was an excellent start to doing bonds payable and serial bonds. Now, what we're going to do Friday is we're going to start with this same problem, 76,561, and actually do the journal entries for 2 years. So if you really want to do well in this class, you have to do this in advance. You can't just wait constantly and watch me do it. The true key to this is here's the amount they pay. You've got to do year one, you've got to do year two. You've got to have the self-discipline to sit down and try that. There's nothing in that problem that you can't do for the first and second year. But I need for you to prove that to yourself. But that's where we'll start, assuming it doesn't snow again or whatever. And I appreciate your sitting and looking at this video. I hope it's been helpful. Heck, if you need to, watch it again. I know the excitement will be wonderful in case, but if you watch it 2 or 3 times, you'll be fine. This is stuff you can do, and this is going to help us get into leases. And leases are really difficult. So we want to make sure that we start off with a strong beginning in this case. So I'll see you tomorrow. Now, the hard part is the last time I did this, I couldn't get the thing to turn off. So we'll see if I do better this time. But I've got this far, so I feel like I've done fairly well no matter what happens. Have a great evening. Take care of yourself.